Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take these, well, often dense and pivotal works of history and social science and try to turn them into something you can really use, something actionable.
And today's deep dive is special because it comes directly from a listener suggestion through our English BookCast channel.
It is, and we really appreciate you sending this one in. It really cuts to the core of how society functions, or maybe how it dysfunctions.
That's a good way to put it. We should probably stress just how foundational this text is. We're diving into The Crowd, a study of the popular mind by Gustave Le Bon, which came out way back in 1895.
And even though it's over a century old, its ideas on, collective behavior, the psychology of a mob, they've become essential reading.
Oh, absolutely. For politicians, for marketers, for really anyone trying to understand social movements, it's one of those books that's kind of lurking in the background of so much modern thought.
It really is. It feels like a blueprint, in a way. If you want to understand what happens when people stop being individuals and start acting as a single entity, this is your starting point.
And Le Bon doesn't ease you into it. There's no gentle preamble.
Not at all. He just hits you right on page 1 with a thesis that he claims defines the entire modern age. He says the key characteristic of our era is What is it exactly?
The substitution of the unconscious action of crowds for the conscious activity of individuals.
Right. I mean, just think about that for a second.
It's a total revolution in a single sentence. He's not talking about new laws or political systems. He's saying the fundamental driver of history has changed.
It's no longer the lone rational person making a plan.
No. It's the anonymous, collective, and this is the key word, unconscious will of the group, what he calls the popular mind. That's the new king.
And he makes this promise, this commitment, to tackle this incredibly explosive topic with a kind of cold detachment. He wants to proceed without being influenced by opinions, theories, and doctrines.
Which is so important because the conclusions he reaches are, well, they're often deeply uncomfortable to read, even today.
To say the least.
Exactly. His goal is purely scientific, or at least that's the aim. He wants to map out this new power. So for today's deep dive, we're really going to focus on the foundations of his argument.
Okay, so where are we starting?
We'll start with the introduction. It sets the historical stage. He calls it the era of crowds. Then we'll move into book 1, which is all about the internal mechanics, the mind of crowds.
And we're saving the rest for later.
Yeah, we'll save the really juicy stuff, how leaders manipulate these crowds, how beliefs are implanted for our next analysis. You have to understand the beast before you can understand how it's tamed or unleashed.
Perfect. So let's start there in the introduction. How does Le Bon see history changing?
Well, right away, he kind of throws out the traditional history textbook. He looks at these huge historical events, the fall of the Roman Empire, things like that, and he says we're looking at the wrong causes.
What do you mean? We're taught it's about, I don't know, political crises, foreign invasions.
Right, or a new dynasty taking over. Le Bon says all of that is just symptoms. They're the visible froth on the surface of the wave.
So if all that stuff is just a symptom, what's the actual cause? What's the real agent of change?
For him, it is always a profound modification in the ideas of the peoples.
In the ideas.
Yes. He insists that the really important changes, the ones that lead to the birth or death of a civilization, they happen in the world of ideas, conceptions, and beliefs.
So it's all in our heads then?
It's in our collective head. These intellectual shifts are the invisible engines of history. All the things we see, the revolutions, the wars, they're just the sudden violent effects of a change in thinking that's been brewing for a long, long time.
That reframes everything. So to understand something like the French Revolution, you shouldn't be looking at the king's actions or the price of bread. Not primarily.
Not primarily. You should be looking at the decades of Enlightenment philosophy that completely changed the collective belief system. The actions followed the ideas.
And that historical view is what leads him to his big claim about his own time.
Precisely. He sees that the old, solid beliefs, the religious ones, the political ones, the social hierarchies, they're all crumbling. And that's left this massive power vacuum.
A vacuum that's being filled by a new force.
The crowd. This is the dawn of the era of crowds.
He calls it the last surviving sovereign force of modern times. And that's a terrifying phrase. How did this mass of people, how did it suddenly supersede kings and parliaments?
It didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly. First, you had the spread of certain ideas, about equality, about democracy, but the ideas alone weren't enough. The crucial step was organized action.
Okay.
Le Bon points to the mechanics of it, the gradual association of individuals into groups that could wield real power. Think of syndicates, labor unions, political parties.
All these new forms of organization that didn't really exist before.
Right. These groups take the vague will of the crowd and give it structure, give it a voice.
So this is basically the birth of mass politics as we know it. What does that do to the individual politician, the leader?
It completely neuters them. That's Le Bon's view. He says the elected representative is now just a spokesman of the committees that have chosen them.
They lose their own agency.
Completely. Any kind of independent thought, any personal initiative, it's gone. They're just carrying out the orders of the organized mass that put them in office. They become functionaries of the collective.
Which leads directly to his big conclusion.
The divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings.
Wow. Not top-down tower anymore. It's power coming up from the bottom from sheer numbers.
The whole direction of legitimacy just flips on its head. But, and this is a huge but, Le Bon is not celebrating this at all. He's actually horrified by the nature of this new power.
He sees it as almost purely destructive. Why?
Because crowds are, in his view, fundamentally irrational and short-sighted. They are quick to act, he says, but only powerful for destruction.
They can tear things down, but they can't build.
Exactly. What do you need to build a civilization? You need fixed rules. You need discipline, foresight, a high culture. The crowd, which is just guided by whatever impulse it feels at the moment, has none of that.
He calls it a barbarian phase.
He does. And his analogy here gets really striking. It's almost biological. He compares crowds to microbes which hasten the dissolution of enfeebled or dead bodies.
So when a civilization is already rotten, as he puts it.
The crowds show up to finish the job. They're the agent of destruction that clears the ground for whatever comes next, often at a terrible cost.
The whole analysis makes it sound like trying to use reason or logic to guide society is just doomed.
And that's his crucial warning, the futility of applying pure reason to social problems. Le Bon is convinced that behind every visible event, like a riot or an election, there are thousands of invisible causes, an immense unconscious machinery at work that we can't possibly analyze rationally.
He has that metaphor about the ocean, right?
Yes. The visible events are like waves on the surface, but they're just an expression of these deep, powerful disturbances happening on the ocean floor that we can't see or measure.
So we're always just reacting to the surface, mistaking the effect for the cause. We try to pass a law to stop the wave, but we don't understand the tectonic shift underneath.
Precisely. But here's the paradox. He calls these same irrational masses the source of something he calls the unconscious genius.
That seems like a massive contradiction.
Yeah.
How can something be both destructive and a source of genius?
It's maybe the most fascinating part of the book. He argues that crowds, even though their individual members are intellectually inferior when grouped together, are guided by these mysterious forces. Destiny, nature, whatever you want to call it.
And his big example is language.
Language, which is incredibly complex, logical, full of subtle rules.
Sure.
Who invented it? No committee of academics sat in a room and engineered the grammar of English or French. It arose spontaneously. It came from the collective unconscious genius of crowds.
So the crowd, acting on instinct, can create something vastly more complex than any individual could plan.
Yes. It's like an animal building an intricate nest. It's a kind of organic, natural intelligence, not a reflective, conscious one.
And this distinction, instinct versus planning, that's the core of his political advice.
It's the core of his lesson for any statesman. Practical wisdom has to trump theoretical justice every single time.
This is maybe the most relevant part for today. He says a lawmaker has to ignore what is theoretically most just and instead focus on what?
On what produces an impression, what seduces the crowd. Because the masses are completely incapable of the kind of foresight needed for, say, complex economic planning.
His example with the two types of taxes is just perfect for illustrating this. It shows how easily logic gets steamrolled by emotion.
Okay, so let's break it down. First, you have the indirect tax. This is a tax you pay every day in tiny little amounts on things you buy.
Like a sales tax.
Exactly. Even if the rate is really high and over a year you pay a huge amount of money, you barely notice it. It will pass unperceived, he says, because it doesn't feel like a big hit. It doesn't strike the imagination.
How do people tolerate it?
Highly tolerated. Now, compare that to a proportional lump sum tax, like a direct payment on your income once a year.
Like filing your taxes in April.
Right. And Le Bon says even if this one lump sum is, let's say, 10 times less burdensome overall, so you're actually paying far less money in total, it will produce universal furious protest.
Why?
Because the number is big. The idea of paying, say, $2,000 all at once will appear immense and will, in consequence, strike the imagination.
The crowd only sees the big, scary number right in front of them. They don't do the abstract math to realize they're actually saving money compared to the other way.
They can't. They're incapable of it. He says it's proof positive that people in a collective never shape their conduct upon the teaching of pure reason. They only react to the immediate, visceral feeling.
Which makes governing through pure reason basically impossible.
Unless you understand these psychological limits and work within them.
So the whole point of studying crowd psychology for him is what? Self-preservation for the elites.
Or at least effective management. It's to arm the statesman with the knowledge of how fragile laws and rational institutions really are when they go up against collective emotion. He says this knowledge is the last resource of the statesman who wishes not to govern them, but at any rate, not to be too much governed by them.
A kind of psychological self-defense. That sets the stage perfectly. So, the era of crowds is here. It rejects reason. It's driven by subconscious beliefs and powerful impressions. Now let's get into Book I and really define this psychological creature.
Right. Now we get to the nature of the beast itself. And when he says crowd, we need to be clear. He's not talking about just, 1,000 people walking down the same street by accident.
No, he makes a distinction. He's talking about a psychological crowd, an organized crowd.
And the key ingredient for that transformation to happen is when the conscious personality vanishes.
Vanishes. That's a strong word.
It is. When you get all these different people, different jobs, different IQs, different backgrounds, and you put them together in the right conditions, they form a collective mind. It's temporary, but for that moment, it's real, and it subjects everyone in it to the law of the mental unity of crowds.
A new being is literally created.
One that has totally different characteristics from the individuals who make it up. Their individual personalities are just gone. They cease to be themselves.
And this can happen without everyone being in the same physical place.
Right. That's an important point he makes. A psychological crowd can form across a whole country if thousands of isolated people are all hit by the same violent emotion at the same time. Think of a major national crisis or huge stock market crash. The unity is mental, not physical.
Okay, so let's get into mechanics. How does this happen? He gives three main causes for this. This transformation from a person into a kind of automaton. The first is about power and anonymity.
Right. The moment an individual becomes part of a crowd, they get this sentiment of invincible power just from the sheer number of people around them.
There's safety in numbers.
More than safety, there's power. And that power lets them give in to instincts they would normally keep in check. And at the same time, because the crowd is anonymous, the sentiment of responsibility, which always controls individuals, disappears entirely.
No one can point the finger at you, so you can do anything.
Exactly. The moral brakes come off. It basically frees the inner barbarian because there are no personal consequences.
Okay, so that's the first one. The second cause he identifies is contagion.
Contagion. He describes it as being like a hypnotic phenomenon. Feelings, ideas, actions. They just spread through the crowd at an incredible speed.
And here's the part that seems counterintuitive to me. He says this contagion is so strong that it actually makes an individual sacrifice their own self-interest for the group.
It does, which is weird, right? If the crowd frees your savage instincts, why would it also make you altruistic?
Yeah.
Because your conscious, rational self-interest gets completely steamrolled by the hypnotic force of the group's shared emotion. An isolated person would rationally fear getting hurt, but in a charging, contagious crowd, that shared feeling of bravery or rage or whatever it is, it just overrides the basic instinct for self-preservation.
It's a kind of irrational, temporary self-sacrifice.
Very irrational. And that brings us to the third cause, which he says is the most important one, suggestibility.
This is the real engine of it all.
This is the core engine. When you're in a psychological crowd, you enter a state that he says is almost identical to being hypnotized. Your conscious personality, your intellect, your critical thinking, your willpower, it all just vanishes.
You become an automaton.
An automaton directed by whatever suggestion the crowd plants in your mind. He uses the analogy of the brain and the spinal cord. It's like Your conscious brain is paralyzed, and only the unconscious, reflexive parts of your nervous system are active and can be controlled.
And the power of that suggestion gets magnified because everyone else is feeling the same thing at the same time.
Precisely. He calls it reciprocity. The suggestion, let's say it's charge that barricade, is the same for everyone, and the fact that it's unanimous makes it exponentially stronger, almost irresistible. If there's anyone strong enough to resist, they're just one person. They get swept away.
So you take all these different people, these heterogeneous elements, you put them together, they lose what makes them unique, and the result is what?
Intellectual regression. A massive drop in intelligence. The collective mind can only operate on the lowest common denominator.
It only shares the mediocre qualities.
Mediocre qualities, ordinary instincts, passions, all the higher level stuff, the specific skills, the education, the critical thinking that makes an individual smart gets, in his words, swamped by the homogeneous. The crowd is simply incapable of thinking at the level of its smartest member.
Which leads us to maybe his most famous and certainly his most brutal line about the crowd's intellect.
It's the one everyone remembers. In crowds, it is stupidity and not mother wit that is accumulated.
It's just so blunt. The highest minds get dragged down to the level of the lowest.
And he has this shocking example to back it up about assemblies of experts.
Right. Tell us about that.
He claims that if you take an assembly of, say, brilliant scientists or economists and you ask them to make a decision on some general matter, their collective decision will be not sensibly superior to the decisions that would be adopted by a gathering of imbeciles. It's not because they're bad people. It's because in that collective setting, they lose access to their specialized knowledge. They can only bring to bear the generalized, mediocre qualities that everyone in the group shares. The crowd state is like an intellectual solvent. It just dissolves individual intelligence into raw instinct.
But, and this is a key distinction, intellectually inferior doesn't automatically mean morally evil. The morality of a crowd is, well, it's all over the place.
It's the great paradox. Intellectually, the crowd is always a downgrade. But from the point of view of feelings, he says, the crowd may, according to circumstances, be better or worse than the individual.
It all depends on the suggestion that takes hold.
Entirely.
And the historical examples are chilling because they show just how fast a group of otherwise decent people can collapse morally, like the members of the French Convention during the Reign of Terror.
Individually, these were men who were, for the most part, enlightened citizens of peaceful habits. Lawyers, doctors, respectable people.
But once they were united in that crowd,
they lost all personal restraint. They didn't hesitate to vote for the most savage proposals. They sent thousands of innocent people to the guillotine. They even turned on each other and decimated their own ranks. They were just automated instruments of the collective revolutionary fervor.
But then you have the complete opposite. The sudden surge of, collective high morality.
That's the famous night of August 4th, 1789. The French nobility in the National Assembly were seized by this wave of contagious enthusiasm.
And what did they do?
One after another, they stood up and enthusiastically renounced all of their ancient hereditary privileges, their tax exemptions, their feudal rights, everything.
An act of incredible self-sacrifice.
Massive. And it's something he's certain that no single one of them would have ever agreed to do alone in a quiet room. It took the moral fever of the crowd to make them suppress their own self-interest so completely.
So the crowd is this irrational creature, prone to intellectual collapse. But it can be either a monster or a saint, depending entirely on the emotional current of the moment.
That's the picture he paints. Now we can move from that general definition to the specific temperament, the operational characteristics of the crowd.
Okay, Book 1, Chapter 2. We start with impulsiveness, mobility, and irritability.
And right away, he puts these traits firmly in the category of what he considers primitive behavior.
Yeah, he draws a very blunt analogy. He links the crowd's behavior to beings belonging to inferior forms of evolution in women, savages, and children. Now, we should be clear, this is Le Bon's 19th century classification, not ours. He's using it as a shorthand for a lack of rational control.
It is. And for him, the crowd is guided almost entirely by the unconscious. It's a slave to momentary impulses. Its actions are dictated by what he calls the spinal cord instead of the brain, which makes its reactions incredibly explosive and unstable.
And the mobility, the mood swings are extreme.
The crowd can pass, he says, instantaneously from most bloodthirsty ferocity to the most extreme generosity and heroism. 1 minute they're martyrs for a cause, the next they're the executioners.
And because they live in the moment, there's no long-term planning.
None whatsoever. No premeditation. The idea of impossibility just vanishes for them because the crowd feels this irresistible power given it by its numerical strength.
If they want something, they want it now.
Right now, and any obstacle that gets in the way is met with what he calls frenzied rage.
He also makes a really interesting, though obviously dated, comparative point here. He compares the impulsiveness of what he calls Latin crowds to Anglo-Saxon crowds.
Yeah, this is a complex part of the original text, and we're just reporting his observation here. He looked at the French crowds he knew well and saw them as extremely irritable and mobile, traits he characterizes as more feminine.
And what's his evidence for that?
He points to French political history. A simple rumor about an ambassador being insulted could be enough to spark a war. A minor military loss could lead to the government being overthrown overnight. They react dramatically to every stimulus.
And he contrasts that with Anglo-Saxon crowds.
Sharply. He brings up a serious British military defeat, the expedition to Khartoum. He notes that in Britain this caused only slight emotion. It didn't lead to the government collapsing or riots in the streets.
So his conclusion is that racial characteristics can kind of put a limit on the impulsiveness?
That's his argument, that the underlying psychology is universal, but national character can moderate it. The Anglo-Saxon crowds, in his view, were just more reserved.
Okay, that brings us to their suggestibility and credulity. This is the vulnerability that makes them so volatile. The crowd is always in a state of expectant attention.
And that expectant attention is like fertile soil. It makes planting a suggestion incredibly easy. And once that suggestion is planted, the crowd loses all critical faculty. They become excessively credulous.
For the crowd, the improbable doesn't exist.
It doesn't. If they're told something that fits their emotional state, they accept it as absolute truth, no matter how absurd it is.
And their thinking isn't linear or logical, it's visual. They think in images.
Totally. You can give them a simple fact, and they will instantly transform it into a dramatic image. And that first image will trigger a whole series of other, often unrelated images. They can't tell the difference between the subjective picture in their head and objective reality.
Which makes them incredibly prone to collective hallucinations.
And he has these terrifying examples of this, even among highly trained people. Let's talk about the frigate, the Belle Poule.
Right. What happened there?
It's a powerful story of mass delusion. The ship is sailing in broad daylight. The watch on deck signals a disabled vessel in the distance.
Okay.
Soon, hundreds of people on the ship, officers and sailors, all trained observers, they all confirm it. They can clearly see a raft covered with men waving their hands, calling for help. The admiral even orders a boat to be lowered for a rescue.
So what did the rescue boat find?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing but a few tree branches covered with leaves that had drifted out from the coast. The moment the objective evidence was seen, the hallucination vanished for everyone. The point isn't that one person was seeing things. It's that the crowd state made hundreds of people share the exact same fabricated reality.
And it's not just sailors. He has an example with scientists, too. The story of Mr. Davy's tricks.
Yeah, Davy was a psychologist who would perform what looked like spiritualist phenomena, writing appearing on slates, that kind of thing. And he did this in front of distinguished scientific observers, including the very famous scientist Alfred Russel Wallace.
These are people trained in critical observation.
The best of the best. And they completely failed. They wrote up these detailed, circumstantial reports confirming that supernatural events had occurred, only to find out later it was all simple parlor tricks.
So even the highest intelligence just evaporates.
It evaporates. Le Bon says the amazing thing isn't the trick itself, but the extreme weakness of the reports from these brilliant men. When you're part of that suggestible group, your personal genius just goes right out the window.
This has huge implications for everything from courtroom testimony to historical records.
It forces you to rethink everything. He basically concludes that you can't trust the testimony of crowds. All those old logic textbooks that say the unanimity of numerous witnesses is the best proof of a fact, he says they need to be rewritten.
In fact, he says the opposite is often true.
He does. The most doubted events are often those verified by the greatest number of persons, because a unanimous story might just be evidence of a really successful collective hallucination.
And this suggestibility means that even history itself is constantly being changed to fit the mood of the moment. His example of Napoleon's image is perfect here.
It's a great one. When Le Bon was writing, Napoleon had only been dead for about 70 years. But in that short time, his public image had been completely transformed. First, he was painted as this idyllic, liberal philanthropist, a man of the people.
And then,
And then, a generation later, he was reimagined as a sanguinary despot, a bloodthirsty tyrant who killed 3 million men for his own ambition. The objective facts didn't change. The crowd's imagination just reshaped the hero to fit a new narrative.
okay, let's move to the last few characteristics. The sentiments of crowds are simple, and they're always exaggerated.
Yes, they see things as a whole, and they always go to extremes. No nuance, no doubt, no subtlety. A tiny suspicion instantly becomes undeniable proof. A slight dislike becomes furious, murderous hatred.
And this is amplified by the lack of responsibility.
Immensely. When the individual feels freed from their own insignificance and part of this powerful mass, they feel a brutal and temporary but immense strength. And that strength expresses itself in exaggerated emotion.
Which means if you want to persuade a crowd, you can't use logic.
Never. An orator who wants to move a crowd has to use violent affirmations, endless repetition, and hyperbole. Never, ever try to prove anything with a reasoned argument. The crowd will just shut you down. You have to appeal to their exaggerated feelings.
And that brings us back to the final paradox. How the crowd can be capable of both the worst crimes and the most incredible heroism.
Right. We've seen how their freed, primitive instincts can lead to savagery. But they're also capable of very lofty morality, of total self-sacrifice. Personal self-interest, the thing that usually rules an individual, is very rarely a powerful motive force with crowds.
They will die for a belief. The Crusades, the French Revolution.
Exactly. Charging into battle with almost no weapons because they are consumed by an idea.
And the anecdotes he shares about moments of strange morality during pure chaos are just.
Yeah.
They're remarkable.
They're deeply unsettling. He points to the men who carried out the September massacres during the Reign of Terror. These guys were brutally murdering people in the prisons, but at the same time, they were meticulously collecting all the watches, wallets, and jewels from their victims.
And depositing them on the committee table.
Unattached, they refused to steal. Looting was seen as immoral and beneath the grand collective purpose of the massacre.
And you see a similar thing with the crowds that stormed the Tuileries Palace in 1848.
Yes. This howling, swarming, ragged crowd bursts into a palace filled with priceless treasures, objects that, if they'd stolen them, could have fed their starving families for months.
And they take nothing.
They laid hands on nothing. It shows that the collective mind, when it's under the influence of a particular suggestion, in that case revolutionary purity, can raise itself above immediate rational self-interest.
And that leads to his final, most provocative thought about all of this.
It's a staggering conclusion. He says that if crowds had always reasoned, if they had always consulted their own immediate self-interest, it is possible that no civilization would have grown up on our planet and humanity would have had no history.
Wow.
It's the crowd's irrational, unconscious devotion to an idea, be it a god, a nation, a revolution, that drives history forward, not the logical, calculating self-interest of individuals.
At a synthesis.
Yeah.
So the crowd is impulsive, gullible, intellectually bankrupt, but also capable of this incredible devotion and action. And it's all because the individual gets replaced by this suggestible, emotionally supercharged automaton.
And that suggestion is everything.
It is. We've clearly laid out the nature of this new power. We've seen its historical rise and its psychological engine with all its volatility and its absolute rejection of reason.
We've covered a huge and, often unsettling landscape here, all grounded in Le Bon's initial observations. We saw that this whole era of crowds is driven by these deep, invisible shifts in belief, not by surface-level politics.
And we learned that the psychological crowd itself operates on this principle of mental unity. It's driven by contagion and suggestibility. The result is this entity that's, well, intellectually a massive step down, where stupidity is accumulated, but at the same time, it's capable of these incredible moral extremes.
Right, and it demands simple, powerful, emotional input, not logic.
And that practical takeaway from the taxation example, it still feels so relevant. The absolute failure of trying to apply pure reason to social problems. If you design a policy that's theoretically perfect but ignores the irrational, image-driven nature of the crowd, you're just designing something to fail.
You're designing it to be rejected or maybe even destroyed.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to chew on based on all this. If the collective mind is truly incapable of the long-term foresight needed for complex economics, like that tax example showed, how much of our modern governance with its, incredibly abstract financial systems, its climate models, its debt planning. How much of it is just falling right into that trap?
The trap of being theoretically elegant but completely inaccessible or even repugnant to the popular mind.
Exactly. And what happens when the masses, guided by suggestion and hyperbole, finally turn against those elegant, rational systems that they never understood in the first place?
That's the challenge that the crowd leaves us with. The state can legislate all it wants, but in the end, the mind of the masses decides.
And we've only just scratched the surface of how that mind is actually guided and controlled. So next time, we're going to continue this deep dive into Gustave Le Bon's work. We're moving into Book 2, The Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds.
We'll be looking at the factors that determine what a crowd believes and how leaders use specific techniques, affirmation, repetition, and prestige to mold those beliefs.
If the unconscious mind of the crowd is the engine, then leaders and their techniques are the steering wheel.
It's going to be a vital look into the real architects of popular opinion and control.
You will not want to miss that deep dive. Until then, keep digging and stay curious.
In the second part, we are turning the page on our source material, diving exclusively into Book 2, The Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds. Last time, we sort of established the basic psychological state of a crowd. That strange mental unity, the overwhelming suggestibility, and that temporary loss of the individual's rational will.
Yeah, it was the groundwork, absolutely. We described the ocean, you could say, the general characteristics of the collective mind. Now, in Book 2, we get to analyze the currents and the tides that actually move that ocean.
Okay.
The mission today really is to understand how ideas and beliefs actually penetrate that collective consciousness. How do they take root, and what determines whether they stick around for a day or for 1,000 years?
And what our source material makes immediately clear is that the pathway to the crowd's mind is not. It's not a single straight road. It's a two-part system. We have these deep tectonic forces that shape the ground, which the author calls the remote factors. And then we have the immediate active levers used by leaders to trigger a response, the immediate factors.
And that's the foundational insight. It's simple, but really, really disruptive. Crowd beliefs are rarely logical conclusions. They're almost always the product of deep, long-term subconscious conditioning. That's the remote factors, which then makes the crowd perfectly vulnerable to these immediate, non-rational psychological triggers.
So if the soil isn't prepared, you can't plant the seed.
Exactly. If the ground isn't fertile, the greatest orator in the world is just wasting his breath.
Okay, that gives us our structure. We'll start with the invisible foundations. Let's unpack these remote factors, starting with the one the author places in the first rank, far, far surpassing all others, the dominance of race.
Right. And we have to instantly clarify this. When the author uses the term race, he is not talking about genetic traits as we might define them today. Not at all.
It's not a biological thing.
No. He is referring to the inherited historical and psychological makeup of a people, what we might call the national character, or, the accumulated habits of centuries. It's this deep, unvarying source from which all sentiments spring.
So it's a psychological bedrock. It acts as an absolute filter. Environmental pressures, political suggestions, economic crises, these are just, what does he call them? Social suggestions of the moment.
That's the phrase.
But if those suggestions are contrary to the inherited genius of the race, the source argues their influence will be momentary, like a wave that just washes over a mountain but doesn't move it.
Precisely. The source uses the contrast between what he calls the Latin crowd and the Anglo-Saxon crowd to illustrate this psychological barrier. And this isn't a small difference. It's absolutely fundamental.
Okay, let's elaborate on that contrast because it's a core point. We see the Latin crowd, which he says is marked by centuries of Roman law and centralized power. It demonstrates an innate psychological tendency towards centralization.
Yes, a deep-seated one. They appeal to the state for nearly every solution. There's an inherent leaning towards strong authority, sometimes even dictatorship.
And it's driven by what he calls an almost religious emphasis on absolute equality.
Their history has, in a way, taught them that order comes from above, and fairness means everyone must be equally subjected to that central power. They are, you could say, comfortable with being controlled, provided that control applies uniformly to everyone.
Okay. Now contrast that with the Anglo-Saxon psychological makeup, and he specifically mentions England and America here.
It's the polar opposite. The Anglo-Saxon crowds behave antithetically. They set minimal store on the state. They instinctively appeal to private initiative and the individual's ability to solve problems.
So their emphasis is not on equality, but on liberty, which in this context means the maximum possible subordination and limitation of state power.
Exactly. And this deep divergence explains why, for example, democratic or socialist movements, even when they're using identical terminology, take fundamentally different, even contrary forms across these nations. Well, the Latin mind interprets democracy as state control that guarantees equality for all. The Anglo-Saxon mind interprets that same word as maximum individual freedom from the state. The word is the same, but the deep racial structure, that psychological filter, dictates that the underlying reality is completely opposed.
Wow. So that predisposition is the first and strongest remote factor,
It's the bedrock.
which flows really seamlessly into the second remote factor, the weight of tradition. Traditions are essentially the cumulative memory of the race, the ideas, the needs, the sentiments of the past. They are the synthesis of the race itself, and they exert this immense, invisible force on every single individual.
And our source material lays out a fascinating paradox here regarding progress. It's a real catch-22. Civilization requires this dense network of traditions to maintain continuity and order. Without them, you just have anarchy.
What?
Yet, by definition, progress requires the slow, often painful destruction of those very same traditions.
So stability and progress are inherently at war with each other. The ideal, then, which he says was realized historically by figures like the Romans and later the English, is not abrupt change, but finding this equilibrium through slow, insensible modifications.
Exactly. Think of how constitutional law evolves in Britain. It's always changing, but in these tiny, almost imperceptible increments. The continuity of the past is never shattered.
And critically, crowds themselves are inherently, deeply conservative.
Tenaciously so. They cling to tradition. They oppose change with this deep, obstinate force. This is why when revolutions happen, even the most violent ones, they rarely change the essence of things. They just change the names and the outward forms.
And the French Revolution serves as the ultimate case study for this. This clash between deep conservatism and an attempt at radical, imposed change.
It's the perfect example.
The revolutionaries went to these extraordinary lengths to eradicate the past. They expelled priests, destroyed churches. They even invented a new rational calendar to replace the religious one. They tried to annihilate old religious ideas by legislative decree.
But the invisible masters, those traditions of the race, are far more powerful than any legislative assembly. Our source points out that within a mere few years, the abolished system of public worship had to be hastily reestablished by the government.
Why?
In deference to universal popular demand. The deep-seated, inherited psychological need for ritual and faith just couldn't be legislated away. Tradition only yields to what the author calls the slow wearing away of centuries, not to the whim of a temporary government.
Okay, so that's race and tradition. Now we move to the third factor, which shows the crowd's profound delusion about where power really lies. This is institutions and the law.
Yes, and the author identifies a pervasive social error here, which he calls the grave delusion.
The grave delusion. And what is that?
It's the belief that laws and institutions possess some kind of magical power to fundamentally change a society's character or cure its deep-seated defects.
This is a cornerstone of modern utopianism, right? The idea that if you just write the perfect constitution, you'll get a perfect society.
Precisely.
Correct.
And the source corrects this harshly. It argues that institutions are merely the outward expression and the outcome of a people's established character, their sentiments, their needs. They are the clothing, not the body.
Yeah.
And they cannot, therefore, possibly change that character, which took centuries to form.
The comparative examples he uses are incredibly powerful because they just strip away that illusion. You look at England, which is often considered the most operationally democratic country in Europe.
And yet it lives successfully under a monarchy. The institution of the crown is an expression of their national character, their need for stability.
And conversely, you look at the Spanish-American republics.
Right. They adopted the most liberal Republican constitutions you can imagine, mirroring the United States.
Right.
But what was the reality on the ground?
Rampant oppressive despotism, constant revolution, and military coup.
The institution was a complete facade.
Yeah.
It was totally divorced from the underlying character of the people. It's the character, shaped by race and tradition, that determines destiny, not the paper on which the laws are written.
The author uses French centralization, this political system where all power flows from Paris, is another example. This system was a result of 1,000 years of political effort and what he calls the imperious needs of the race.
And so when the revolution attempted to erase the past, what did they find? They were forced to respect and even strengthen that centralization because it was an inherent necessity for the French psyche.
There's a warning in there.
A stern one. The source warns that any politician who attempts to destroy such a deep-seated structure risks a frightful civil war. The implication is crystal clear. You can't redesign a nation's deep psychology through constitutional decree.
So the influence of political systems themselves is small, almost negligible in shaping fundamental character. But here's the key twist, and it connects this remote factor to our later discussion on immediate triggers. What truly influences the crowd regarding these laws are not the institutions themselves, but the words and allusions that are attributed to them. The name of the law is more potent than its actual effect.
And that sets the stage perfectly for the final and perhaps most contentious remote factor, the failures of instruction and education.
This one really targets what the author calls the steadfast democratic dogma, the modern belief that widespread education will automatically improve and equalize all men, leading to some kind of societal perfection. This belief is almost impossible to attack publicly, yet the source launches a full-scale critique focusing on the French model, what he calls the Latin system.
And the critique centers on a fundamental psychological error in how that system was designed. It assumes that intelligence is developed purely by learning abstract concepts in textbooks by heart.
It's all about memorization.
It's a system built entirely around reciting by heart and obeying. It's designed to produce compliance, not competence. The philosopher M. Jules Simon lamented that this system produced no judgment, no personal initiative, and zero preparation for the struggle of real life.
So it creates individuals who are just saturated with useless theoretical knowledge, like being able to recite the genealogy of the sons of Clotaire, but who are utterly unprepared for the world of work or for making decisions.
And this flawed system churns out two specific, highly volatile products that destabilize society. First, an army of proletarians who are discontented with their lot.
And who are these proletarians?
These are working men or peasants who, having spent their youth absorbing abstract knowledge, now feel that manual labor is beneath them. They disdain the life they were born into and are ready to revolt because society hasn't rewarded them for their theoretical diplomas.
And the second product is a certain type of frivolous bourgeoisie.
Yes, they are skeptical, having been taught to doubt all past traditions, yet paradoxically, they display a superstitious confidence in the state. They expect the state to be their providence, responsible for their happiness,
while simultaneously displaying ceaseless hostility toward the government for failing to deliver on that impossible promise.
The outcome is a profound job crisis. The state acts as an education factory, manufacturing masses of diploma holders who immediately besiege public functions, demanding employment that only the state can provide. But since only a fraction can actually be utilized, the immense majority of the unemployed become educated but frustrated enemies of society, perfectly prepared for a revolution.
The numbers cited are truly shocking for that era. 20,000 unemployed schoolmasters in the Seine alone. Individuals who, by virtue of their useless knowledge, were now driven to resent the very society that funded their theoretical studies.
And to really emphasize the disastrous effect of this Latin system, the source relies on the analysis of Hippolyte Taine, contrasting it with the Anglo-Saxon model used in England and America.
So in that model, training is based on object lessons, practical apprenticeship, and experience. It's hands-on.
Exactly. The engineer is trained in a workshop, learning by doing and problem-solving, not just memorizing equations in a classroom. Taine argued that this builds judgment, practical experience, initiative, and character. It prepares youth for life.
Whereas the French system, the pure rote memorization aimed at passing a single decisive examination, disqualifies youth for life. Taine claimed it leads to painful falls and mental and moral imbalance because they possess intellectual tools that cannot actually be applied.
They're theoretical, not practical creatures.
This critique of education is, wow, it's maybe the most crucial remote factor because it describes how the individual mind is prepared to transition from rational thought to crowd suggestibility. It shakes the ground, creating this army of the dissatisfied, just waiting for the leader who can use immediate triggers to ignite their frustration.
It's the tinder waiting for the spark.
We've established the deep, slow-moving forces: race, tradition, institutions, and education that condition the crowd to be restless, conservative, and theoretically educated, yet practically discontent. Now, let's pivot. The groundwork is laid. What are the immediate factors, the direct means by which the crowd's mind can be activated and persuaded?
We start with what is arguably the most fundamental tool of influence, the magical power of words and formulas. The source notes a critical distinction here. Words are not powerful because of their real, logical dictionary meaning, but because of the vivid images they evoke in the collective unconscious.
He says, handled by an artist, they truly possess the mysterious power formerly attributed to them by the adepts of magic. And the words with the greatest influence are those whose sense is the most ill-defined.
Think about the short syllables that dominate political discourse. Democracy, socialism, equality, liberty. They are, in a way, vague containers. Their very lack of precise definition allows them to synthesize and embody diverse, often contradictory, unconscious aspirations and hopes held by the multitude.
So every individual pours their own personal dream into that single word.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the meaning is constantly mobile. You mentioned earlier the challenge of translating a dead language. The source asserts it is absolutely impossible because modern concepts replace ancient ones that were totally distinct.
Right, the example of liberty for an ancient Athenian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For them, it was tied fundamentally to the cult of Athens or Sparta. It certainly didn't encompass the modern concept of freedom of thought, which wasn't even suspected at the time.
So the word survives, but the meaning is transformed by centuries of racial psychology and tradition. This makes the job of a successful statesman incredibly subtle. They must change the words without necessarily changing the things, especially when the things, like centralized authority, are bound up in the inherited racial constitution.
Tocqueville observed this linguistic mastery during the French consulate. They were brilliant at rebranding. They had inherited these old, hated tax names like the tail and the gabelle. To make them acceptable to the crowd, they simply replaced those odious names with new ones. Land tax and tax on salt.
Same tax, same burden, but a totally new psychological acceptance because the word had changed.
It's incredible, isn't it? And this highlights the tyranny of phrases. The power of words is so absolute that odious actions or systems become palatable when they're dressed in popular terms. The source uses the chilling example of the Jacobins, who invoked liberty and fraternity, the most appealing terms of the revolution, to install an oppressive despotism and commit what the author calls human hecatombs.
They didn't argue for murder, they argued for the purity of their words.
And we circle back to the remote factor of race yet again. Even currently, popular words like democracy and socialism, which are bandied about globally, mean fundamentally contrary things to the Latin mind versus the Anglo-Saxon mind. We saw how for one it means state control, and for the other it means individual freedom. The power of the word is therefore determined not by objective reality, but by the psychological filter of the group hearing it.
And that psychological filter is hungry for the second immediate factor, the necessity of illusions.
Yes. Since the dawn of civilization, crowds have been influenced by illusions, be they religious, philosophic, or social. The source deems them formidable sovereign powers.
Without these necessary fictions, he argues, humanity would not have had the motivation to emerge from barbarism.
These illusions, these feudal shadows, as the author calls them, have historically forced nations to create whatever splendid art or great civilization they boast. They provide a common, shared ideal that is greater than the individual's immediate, narrow self-interest.
This is where the source laments the failure of modern philosophy. By methodically destroying the religious and political illusions of the past century, by subjecting everything to cold, clinical reason philosophers inadvertently dried up the springs of hope. Man was left face to face with the blind and silent forces of nature without any charming ideal to guide him.
Philosophy failed to replace the destroyed illusions with an equally compelling, charming new ideal. The crowd, however, cannot tolerate a vacuum of belief. It must have illusions at all cost, so it turns to the latest and most vital illusion, socialism.
The source identifies socialism's power not in its economic viability, but in its nature as a belief. It is championed by minds sufficiently ignorant of things as they are in reality to venture boldly to promise mankind happiness.
I mean, the implication is that the masses actively avoid truth if it is not to their taste. They prefer to deify error. The person who supplies the charming illusion is the master. The person who insists on painful truth is always the victim.
That is a harsh assessment of collective human psychology, but it flows logically from the premise that the crowd is incapable of reason. But if words and illusions work on sentiment, what is the only immediate factor capable of imposing a cold, hard, objective truth?
That brings us to experience.
Yeah.
The supreme, brutal educator.
Experience is described as almost the only effective way to solidly establish a truth or destroy dangerous illusions. But it comes with a horrifying caveat, doesn't it?
It does. It must be large-scale, intensely painful, and frequently repeated.
Historical tuition is generally useless because one generation quickly forgets the agonizing lessons learned by the last. The crowd only learns through massive, shared trauma.
And the source details the sheer scale of the experiments required to teach these lessons.
Consider the core truth that society cannot be refashioned entirely by pure reason, a truth that seems self-evident now. How did humanity learn that?
It required the gigantic, bloody experiment of the French Revolution, costing millions of lives.
And to prove that dictator and military empires are costly and ultimately ruinous, the source notes that the nation required two massive ruinous experiences in just 50 years.
Resulting in the loss of 3 million men and the necessity of permanent, crippling, standing armies. And even then, the lesson was not perfectly absorbed, which just shows how quickly the crowd forgets the cost of its passions.
Even simple military or economic realities require staggering proof. To disprove the politician, Thiers claimed that the German army was merely a harmless national guard. A terrible war was required.
And the lesson that protectionism eventually ruins nations, even if it's mathematically sound, requires at least 20 years of disastrous experience to be established in the collective mind.
The key takeaway here is the extreme inertia of the crowd. Beliefs implanted by illusions and rhetoric can only be eradicated by suffering on a massive collective scale.
Which leads directly to the final immediate factor, the powerlessness of reason.
Given everything we've just discussed, the emotional appeal of words, the necessity of illusions, the brutality of experience as the sole teacher, it's logical that reason could almost be omitted entirely when discussing crowd influence.
Almost completely. Crowds cannot be influenced by sophisticated reasoning. They only comprehend rough and ready associations of ideas. If you try to argue a detailed, subtle point, you will lose them instantly. Their reasoning resembles that of the Eskimo, who thinks glass should melt like ice because both are transparent, or the savage who believes eating a brave foe's heart acquires their bravery. It's primitive and associative.
Okay, I have to challenge this a bit, though. If reason is utterly powerless in the collective, how do we explain scientific or technological progress, which relies entirely on logic and evidence? Is the author suggesting that scientific understanding is confined strictly to the individual?
That is precisely the implication. Logic, evidence, and critical thinking belong to the realm of solitary thought, the laboratory, the library, the quiet study. The moment a scientist tries to present his logical finding to a passionate crowd, it has to be framed as an affirmation, sometimes even an illusion, or it will fail.
Because the crowd's logic is just immediate generalization. One bad employer means all capital is exploitative.
Exactly. One dishonest politician means the whole system is corrupt. And this explains the strategy of every successful orator. They appeal exclusively to sentiments, never to logic. The anecdote about the orator GP is a perfect real-world test case. He was faced with this massive, furious crowd demanding the execution of a military marshal accused of treason.
What would a logician have done?
A logician would have tried to argue the marshal's innocence, detailing the evidence, which would have instantly inflamed the crowd even further. Instead, GP acted purely on sentiment. He didn't argue the innocence. He promised pitiless justice and vowed that the government would conclude the inquiry with severity.
So he seemed to agree with their emotion.
He acknowledged their emotional demand for vengeance, and that calmed them instantly. The marshal was later quietly released, saved not by reason, but by a momentary rhetorical concession to passion.
This reveals the great paradox that ties Book 2 together. It is not by reason, but often in spite of it, that the most profound and essential collective sentiments of civilization, honor, self-sacrifice, religious faith, patriotism are created and maintained.
Reason is too cold, too calculating. It would never have spurred humanity with the ardor and hardihood that these passionate illusions have.
Okay, so we have the prepared, non-rational mind of the crowd. We now move to the final piece of this puzzle. The immediate conscious methods used by the leaders to forge and spread these non-rational beliefs, the actual mechanics of persuasion, and it all starts with the leaders of crowds.
Yes. Whether it's a gathering of men or animals, the source states that a crowd instinctively places itself under a chief. A crowd is defined as a servile flock that is incapable of doing without a master.
And the leader's will becomes the nucleus around which the chaotic opinions of the crowd are grouped and given shape.
And the profile of this leader is fascinating. They are almost always men of action, never thinkers, and are frequently recruited from the ranks of the morbidly nervous, excitable, half-deranged persons who are bordering on madness. They're often fanatics, possessing a conviction that borders on obsession.
Their power comes entirely from this fanaticism, then.
Entirely. They are completely hypnotized by the idea they champion, be it religious, political, or social. Think of Robespierre, who was mesmerized by Rousseau's theoretical ideas and then set about implementing them using the most brutal methods imaginable.
Because their conviction is so strong, they ignore personal interests, self-preservation. They often actively solicit martyrdom.
And this fanatical self-assurance creates an immense, intoxicating power of suggestion. The multitude is always ready to listen to the man of strong, unwavering will because their own will is paralyzed within the crowd.
The source makes a crucial distinction, though, between two classes of leaders, defined by their durability.
Right. First, you have those with intermittent will. These are the violent, brave, audacious types, excellent for sudden, short-lived, violent enterprises. Figures like Ney or Murat or Garibaldi, energetic adventurers who can seize a kingdom through sheer audacity.
But their energy is transitory. They are quickly exhausted and often require constant direction themselves when they return to ordinary life.
Then you have the far rarer category, the leaders with enduring will. These are the true founders of religions and great long-term undertakings. St. Paul, Muhammad, Christopher Columbus, or even the industrial titan Ferdinand de Lesseps. The world belongs to them because their capacity for persistent, concentrated will force is just immensely powerful.
De Lesseps is a perfect case study for the ephemeral nature of prestige that's built on that enduring will. His success in cutting the Suez Canal was a triumph of single-minded focus, vanquishing men and things. He maintained absolute prestige for decades.
But then what happened when he took on Panama? He had aged, his enduring will began to falter, and the mountains and the jungles resisted. The moment success evaporated, his prestige instantly vanished.
He went from being a historical hero to being condemned by the crowd as a vulgar rogue.
Overnight. It shows that success is the only sustaining element for a leader's power, and that failure sets the stage for the concrete methods these leaders rely on to imbue a crowd with lasting beliefs. The source calls it the Holy Trinity of Persuasion.
The Trinity, which comprises affirmation, repetition, and contagion. Let's start with affirmation. This must be simple, pure, and entirely free of any reasoning or proof.
Yes. The conciser and more destitute of proof the statement is, the more weight it carries. We see this mechanical use of affirmation everywhere, in religious doctrines, legal codes, and most visibly in the modern era, commercial advertising and political slogans. There is no argument, merely an assertion of truth presented as fact.
But a single affirmation, no matter how bold, is useless without repetition. The source quotes Napoleon, who claimed repetition is the only figure in rhetoric of serious importance. Why is that?
Because mere repetition, the constant pounding of the same phrase, is the only way to embed the statement into the unconscious self, bypassing the critical faculties entirely. After countless repetitions, the affirmation begins to enter that deep region of the unconscious where our actions are forged, and it's accepted as demonstrated, proven truth.
This is how commercial advertising works its magic. When you see the claim that X's chocolate is the best for the 100th time, your critical mind has long stopped resisting. You forget the source of the claim, and it becomes a certitude implanted in your psyche.
And the only thing powerful enough to combat a statement repeated 1,000 times is a contrary statement repeated 1,000 times.
Once repetition creates a current of opinion, the third mechanism intervenes, contagion.
Right. Ideas, sentiments, and emotions spread across the crowd like microbes. This is a powerful, non-rational mechanism that you can see even in the animal kingdom. A panic seizing a few sheep spreads instantly to the entire flock.
And the source stresses that contagion doesn't even require simultaneous presence. The revolutionary movement of 1848, for instance, broke out in Paris and rapidly infected minds across Europe that had already been psychologically prepared by those remote factors.
The author views imitation, which sociologists often cite as a social driver, as merely an effect of contagion. Contagion is so powerful that it forces people to adopt opinions even contrary to their personal immediate interest. The clear example here is how upper classes often adopt socialist or revolutionary doctrines, knowing full well that they themselves will be the first victims should those doctrines triumph.
So the psychological force of the contagion overrides self-preservation.
It absolutely does. An idea might start logically, evolved by a philosopher in solitude, But then it's distorted by a leader, further deformed by a small political sect, and then once it becomes a popular truth propagated by contagion, it eventually returns to influence the upper, more educated classes of the nation. Reason originates the idea, but irrational contagion shapes its destiny.
And the ultimate synthesis of affirmation, repetition, and contagion is this mysterious force that grants overwhelming authority to both men and ideas. Prestige.
Yes, and prestige is defined not necessarily by admiration or fear, but as a mysterious force that enforces authority and paralyzes our judgment. It exists even when we don't understand or admire the object, like the prestige accorded to the dead, Caesar or Buddha, or even monstrous Indian divinities.
The effect of prestige is critical. It prevents us from seeing things as they really are.
It really does. Let's use the source as examples to truly grasp this cognitive dissonance. If you pick up Homer today and read it for the first time, you might find the material immensely boring. Yet who would dare say so?
Nobody. The prestige of Homer paralyzes your judgment, forcing you to admire the text simply because its renown is ancient.
Or when you view the Parthenon, you don't see the wretched ruin. It actually is a dilapidated collection of broken stones. You see it through the lens of its historic memories, its idealized perfection, and the civilization it represents. Prestige supplies the illusion that reason cannot touch.
That's acquired prestige. But the most powerful form is personal prestige.
This is an inherent magnetic faculty independent of titles, wealth, or fame. It is the raw power possessed by figures like Buddha, Joan of Arc, and Napoleon. It's an inward strength that dictates absolute submission without discussion.
The anecdote about Napoleon's first encounter with his generals in Italy perfectly illustrates this submission. General Augereau, this powerful, rough-hewn swashbuckler, arrived hostile, having planned to be insolent to the little upstart General Bonaparte.
But the moment Napoleon entered the room girt with his sword, putting on his hat, giving orders, Augereau was instantly vanquished and inspired with awe. He confessed to his colleague that the little general had immediately impressed him with a sense of superiority before Napoleon had achieved any military victories of note.
General Van Damme later confessed the same absolute surrender, admitting that in Napoleon's presence he would tremble like a child and would jump into a fire if ordered.
This is pure, raw, magnetic submission born of fascination. It has nothing to do with logic, merit, or reasoned argument. It's the source of Napoleon's miraculous return from Elba, an isolated man conquering France without firing a shot, because the general sent to arrest him simply submitted instantly to his superior will.
But this magnetic force built on success is fundamentally fragile. Prestige's fragility is absolute.
Yes, the disappearance of success is almost always followed instantly by the disappearance of prestige. The crowd, which bowed so profoundly, takes fierce revenge for having submitted to a vanished superiority.
Like Robespierre. While he held immense power and prestige, he sent colleagues to the executioner daily. The instant he lost the vote and his power waned, his prestige vanished.
And the same crowd followed him to the guillotine with the very same imprecations they had used against his victims moments before. Furthermore, prestige cannot tolerate discussion. To admire, the object must be kept at a distance. As soon as it is called into question, it ceases to exist.
We've seen how race prepares the psychological ground and how prestige and repetition are used as tools. Now, let's categorize the results of these processes by looking at the resulting hierarchy of beliefs, starting with fixed beliefs, the pillars of civilization.
These are permanent beliefs enduring for centuries. Christianity, feudalism, nationalism, the idea of the family, they form the real, enduring framework of any civilization. And the rule for their survival is simple and stark.
Which is?
A general belief, which is little else than a fiction, can only survive if it is not subjected to examination.
So once implanted, the power of a fixed belief is invincible. It imposes itself even on the most luminous intelligences of the age. The source notes that powerful geniuses like Galileo and Newton, who used reason to overturn the entire physical world, never questioned the religious legends they found personally barbarous.
They didn't dare, because those fixed beliefs formed the unquestionable framework of their society. The belief, even if absurd from a purely rational standpoint, becomes the source of all institutions, arts, and customs. This is why nations have historically displayed such powerful intolerance in defense of their core dogmas. That intolerance is actually a necessary virtue for the survival of the belief.
The source also raises a critical warning concerning the rising power of socialism compared to older fixed beliefs such as religion.
Yes, and the fundamental weakness of socialist beliefs. And what distinguishes them from successful religious ones is that the ideal of happiness is intended to be realized on earth immediately by political means. Religious ideals are safely placed in a future life, which makes them immune to terrestrial refutation.
But the promises of earthly socialism will be tested in reality. When efforts toward realization begin, the vanity of those promises will appear, and the belief will rapidly lose its prestige.
Exactly. The strength of the socialist illusion increases only until the day of its attempted triumph, at which point reality sets in, and it risks a very rapid collapse.
Okay, so above this deep, fixed substratum, we find the changeable opinions of crowds.
Yes, these are the superficial beliefs that spring up and die out incessantly. Things like fleeting literary movements, like Romanticism or Naturalism, or transient artistic theories.
But even these changes are often more superficial than real. The fundamental underlying race beliefs remain unchanged. For instance, wildly opposed French political parties, royalists, radicals, socialists, all share an identical underlying deep-seated political ideal tied to that centralized French mental structure.
And history shows extreme volatility only on the surface. Look at the political whiplash suffered by one generation between 1790 and 1820. That single generation went from being ardently monarchical to violently revolutionary to blindly imperialist under Napoleon, and back again to monarchical.
That is extreme mobility, but it is confined to the superficial political system while the deep character remained constant. So why are these superficial opinions even more unstable and volatile today than in the past? The source cites three primary reasons that characterize the modern era of crowds.
First, the weakening of old beliefs. The decline of religious and traditional fixed beliefs just clears the ground, making the collective mind susceptible to any haphazard, temporary opinion that sweeps through. The absence of a strong foundation allows these temporary whims to flourish.
Second, the increased crowd power. The rising unchecked power of the masses allows their inherent extreme mobility of ideas to manifest without hindrance, because the older aristocratic or rational checks that once governed opinion have vanished.
And the third massive factor in the modern world is the press. The development of the newspaper press means that contrary opinions are constantly brought before the crowds, often within hours of each other.
This is where the volatility really accelerates. Any suggestion that might lead to a stable, generalized opinion created by affirmation and repetition is immediately destroyed by suggestions of an opposite, contradictory character delivered via the competing press.
Opinions die out before they can possibly become general or acquire true, fixed prestige. The old, staid, influential organs that once shaped opinion have been replaced by a press driven by commercial competition. These papers merely reflect the fluctuations of public opinion rather than shaping it.
They become mere agencies for instant information and amusement, obliged to follow the masses wherever they turn. This volatility leads to a paradox concerning modern governance. Governments are now powerless to direct opinion. They merely follow it, often in dread.
Yes. Statesmen are forced to operate in accordance with principles in which they may have ceased to believe privately, simply because public opinion dictates it. Even the most powerful figures, be they popes or kings, consent to be interviewed and submit their views to the immediate judgment of the crowd.
The result is a growing indifference to everything that does not touch immediate, obvious interests, coupled with an extreme divergency of convictions.
The modern man is increasingly a prey to indifference, which, while certainly a symptom of social decadence, has an unexpected saving grace.
And this is the critical transition. Instability as a positive, counter-tyrannical force. The growing indifference and extreme instability of the opinions of crowds, though a symptom of decline, may paradoxically be the only factor postponing the total ruin of civilization.
It's a fascinating thought. If a single opinion, be it socialist, religious, or political, were able to acquire sufficient prestige in this volatile environment to enforce general, unquestionable acceptance, it would be endowed with such tyrannical strength that the era of free discussion would close entirely. The volatility of the crowd, by preventing any single dogmatic belief from acquiring absolute, unquestionable power, prevents an absolute modern tyranny of thought.
We have completed our analysis of Book 2. We've synthesized the monumental power of remote factors like inherited character and tradition and the immediate magical influence of words and prestige. We understand that the complex, often contradictory beliefs of the era of crowds are manufactured through emotion and repetition, rarely logic.
We've concluded that institutions are merely garments, laws are irrelevant to character, and the wrong kind of education produces an army of malcontents. And we've seen that beliefs, whether fixed or fleeting, rely fundamentally on fiction, repetition, and contagion, not evidence.
Now, having understood the generic mind of the crowd from Book 1 and how its opinions are formed here in Book 2, we shift our focus to see these psychological laws in the highest stakes environment.
Exactly. The next and final deep dive will analyze Book 3, the classification and description of the different kinds of crowds. We will dissect specific organized collectivities like criminal crowds, juries, and perhaps most importantly, parliamentary assemblies, and see how the general non-rational laws we have established play out in these distinct and incredibly powerful groups that shape the destiny of nations.
As we anticipate that final analysis, let us leave you with this thought, reflecting on the enduring power of illusions and repetition over pure reason. If experience is the only effective teacher for humanity, requiring painful, large-scale experiments costing millions of lives to establish basic truths, how many more catastrophic, painful experiments must our generation endure before the illusion of instant, purely rational social change is finally laid to rest?
In this last part of our deep dive, we move from the foundational psychological laws, how a crowd forms its beliefs, how it thinks and reasons, straight into the applied science. Our focus now is exclusively on Book 3 of the text, where the author takes those general rules and imposes a precise taxonomy on the specific organized crowds that really define modern society.
It's the ultimate transition from theory to consequence. It really is. We're no longer discussing the collective mind in some abstract sense.
Right.
Instead, we're looking at where this mentality actually manifests. In the seats of power.
The legislative body, the electoral booth.
Exactly. The courtroom, the criminal street mob. The author's mission is to classify and describe these groups because, as he states, the unconscious action of crowds is rapidly becoming he calls it the last surviving sovereign force of the modern world.
That is the essential takeaway, isn't it? If individual personalities have vanished and this collective mind is now setting the destiny of nations, we need a guide. We need to understand the different forms this psychological sovereign takes.
And what dictates its unpredictable behavior?
We have to know who or what is setting the course.
So we begin the classification by drawing a really sharp line. It's between a simple multitude and an organized crowd.
Okay.
A simple multitude is just. It's an agglomeration. Think of disparate individuals, maybe from different races, just gathered by chance. Invading barbarian hordes are a good example.
So they're only held together by one thing.
Temporarily, yes. By the command of a single, powerful chief. That's it.
But the organized or the psychological crowd, that's a different beast entirely.
Completely different. That's where the conscious personality disappears and the collective mind with all its specific traits, the suggestibility, the impulsivity, that's when it takes over.
Right.
But here is the critical complication. Even within that psychological crowd, the characteristics are not uniform all over the world. The author introduces this bedrock concept that really overrides everything else.
The genius of the race.
The genius of the race.
It seems a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? That the crowd mentality, which we've said overrides individual intelligence, it doesn't completely override these inherited racial traits. How does the author reconcile that, this genius of the race, with the total collapse of conscious thought?
Well, the genius of the race isn't about intelligence. That's the key. It's about the inherited unconscious groundwork of thought. It's the solid substratum upon which all our individual traits, good or bad, are based.
And this substratum acts as a kind of check.
A massive check. It severely limits the psychological characteristics of any given crowd. It's like a filter for suggestions.
And we see this played out in the profound contrast he draws between two major cultural groups.
Yes, the Latin crowds and the Anglo-Saxon crowds.
Right.
The Latin crowd, it doesn't matter if they're socialist, monarchist, or liberal, they invariably display a few key traits.
Such as?
They appeal constantly to the state for intervention. They show this marked, almost obsessive tendency toward centralization, and they inherently lean toward dictatorship.
And this is all coupled with a big emphasis on equality.
A fierce emphasis on equality, yes. This inherent appeal to the state really defines their collective thinking, no matter what the political issue of the day is.
Okay, so that's one side.
Precisely. Now, you contrast that with the Anglo-Saxon crowd. They, historically, set virtually no store on the state.
They're looking elsewhere for solutions.
Exclusively to private initiative to solve social problems, and their primary ideological focus is liberty, not equality.
So that fundamental difference in their inherited collective spirit means a suggestion that would say, galvanize a crowd in France.
Hmm.
Might be completely ignored or even rejected by a crowd in England.
Absolutely. So when you see these powerful political ideologies sweeping the globe movements like democracy or socialism, they are never monolithic.
They're molded by the racial substrate they land on.
They are. The author's observation here is so sharp. He says there are almost as many different forms of socialism and democracy as there are nations. This genius of the race is the force that prevents the collective mind from becoming completely volatile or, arbitrary.
It's the underlying structure.
It acts as the underlying structure that limits the crowd's extreme changes of humor.
And this brings us back to that contrast with the barbarian state.
Mm-hmm.
The author posits that the pure crowd state, the one characterized by extreme volatility and unreflecting power, is essentially a state of barbarism.
Yes. A race only truly frees itself from this barbarian state when it manages to acquire what he calls a solidly constituted collective spirit.
Which is the genius of the race.
It is. This collective spirit provides the stable framework, the cohesion, that's necessary for a civilization to build durable institutions and move beyond just immediate impulse.
Okay, so once we understand that racial substrate, then we can start to examine the specific structural classification of these organized crowds.
Right. The author gives us two main types. First, you have the heterogeneous crowds. These are composed of individuals of any description, any profession, any intelligence level.
This is the most common form we'd encounter.
By far, it's the one we see in our daily lives.
And within that heterogeneous category, the distinction seems to hinge entirely on one concept: responsibility.
Correct. We have the anonymous crowd, like a street mob. Their defining characteristic is the complete absence of the sentiment of individual responsibility.
Because there's safety in numbers.
The sheer numbers make them feel invincible and completely unaccountable for their actions. And this, of course, unleashes the most dangerous, lowest common denominator of behavior.
And then there are the crowds that are not anonymous.
Like juries or parliamentary assemblies. Now, while they are still crowds and they're still susceptible to suggestion, the knowledge that they are identifiable, that they might be called to account for their actions, that slightly restrains the complete dissolution of their personal character.
It's a key distinction.
A very key distinction that defines their actions, which we're about to see in the courts and the legislative chambers. The second main type, just to touch on it, is homogeneous crowds.
Sects, castes, classes.
Right. Political or religious sects, military or priestly castes, and then classes like the middle class or peasants. These are composed of similar elements, which makes their collective characteristics far more unified, more specialized, and often, more persistently dangerous.
But the focus of Book 3, the political machinery of modern life,
that rests overwhelmingly on those heterogeneous types.
So let's turn now to the criminal crowd. This designation itself is shocking because the author immediately says that calling them criminal is, psychologically misleading.
It is, even if their actions result in mass murder. He fundamentally reframes what criminality means in a collective setting.
So these acts, as horrific as they are,
they're driven by an irresistible collective suggestion, a contagion. The individuals are forced into what he calls an automatic and unconscious state.
Meaning the malice, the calculated foresight of a typical criminal is just absent.
It's absent. So the action is savage, often bestial, but the intent is not individual criminal intent. The crowd in this state is operating purely on instinct or a powerful suggestion.
And this leads to that profound psychological realization. The individuals involved in these crowd crimes are often absolutely convinced of something else entirely.
They're convinced that they are acting in obedience to a noble, a patriotic, or a profoundly moral duty.
They see themselves as instruments of justice.
Genuinely. As instruments of justice or fate, not as malicious actors. The conscious personality has just vanished, and it's been replaced by this collective, distorted suggestion.
We see this immediate transformation in the case study of Monsieur Delaunay's murder after the taking of the Bastille. Can you describe that scene for us? Because it just perfectly encapsulates this instant adoption of suggestion.
It's a terrifying scene. The governor of the Bastille, Monsieur Delaunay, is surrounded by this excited, frenzied crowd. He's suffering blows from all sides. While he's struggling, he accidentally kicks one of his immediate assailants.
A small act in the middle of chaos.
A tiny act. But instantly, the suggestion is thrown out by someone in the crowd. He kicked him. The kicked man must kill him.
And the man who adopts this suggestion isn't a hardened killer.
No, not at all. He's an unemployed cook.
An unemployed cook.
That's right. And this cook, whose name is actually recorded in historical accounts, instantly believes that, since this is the general opinion of everyone assembled, the act must be patriotic.
So he convinces himself.
He convinces himself that he is destroying a monster and that he deserves a medal for it. He tries to commit the murder with a borrowed sword, which is blunt, and he fails. So then he resorts to his professional tool.
His knife.
A small black-handled knife.
The use of his professional utensil to perform a murder that he believes is a national service. That link between murder and patriotic duty is just chillingly illustrative of how suggestion can take over.
The act is professional, meticulous, and it's completely divorced from any sense of personal responsibility. He goes home afterward expecting to be paid for his service.
And that total lack of remorse.
That's the hallmark, because the act was performed under this powerful illusion of duty. That is the hallmark of the criminal crowd.
So if that's the micro example, the macro example has to be the September massacres of 1792 during the French Revolution.
Wanting details, yes. This was a heterogeneous crowd carrying out atrocities over several days.
In this case study, it demonstrates the full spectrum of crowd psychology in action.
It really does. I mean, who were these slayers? They weren't hardened mercenaries. They were primarily shopkeepers and artisans.
Regular people.
Bootmakers, locksmiths, minor clerks. These were average citizens, but they were deeply convinced that by serving as judge and executioner simultaneously, they were performing a patriotic duty that was critical to the revolution's survival.
And their rudimentary justice system was terrifying in its simplicity.
It was horrifyingly efficient. The crowd decided, essentially, to slaughter nobles, priests, and officers en masse.
Why? What was the logic?
The logic was that their profession alone was deemed proof of their guilt in the eyes of a good patriot. The collective, rudimentary conscience was satisfied. Once the profession proved guilt, the execution could proceed legally without any individual compunction.
What's truly fascinating, though, is the contradictory sentiments that this same crowd displayed. They were capable of terrifying brutality, but also these strange moments of strict morality.
The emotional volatility was extreme. Taine recorded that when their impromptu tribunal acquitted a prisoner, the executioners, the men literally covered in blood, would embrace and applaud the acquitted person with transports of joy. Great enthusiasm.
But then they'd turn right back around.
Immediately, they would return to the task of wholesale massacre without missing a single beat.
So they could swing instantly from savage killers to joyous patriots celebrating justice. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, they maintained a bizarre financial honesty.
That's the most arresting detail, I think. Despite the bloodlust, the slaughterers strictly refused to steal the victims' money, their watches, their jewels.
They didn't touch them.
No. They meticulously deposited these items on the committee tables. It demonstrates the crowd's ability for a kind of temporary, rigid morality that is entirely divorced from the greater atrocity they were committing.
They would commit mass murder for patriotism, but not theft for profit.
Precisely. And the brutality itself became a spectacle, which further demonstrates this reversion to a barbarian state.
It became an event.
Literally an event. Benches were arranged in the streets and courtyards explicitly for the ladies, who were described as being delighted to witness the killing of aristocrats.
Unbelievable.
And there were macabre demands, like ordering victims to be struck only with the back of the sword, specifically to prolong their agony. This shift from what they saw as necessary execution to a frenzied, prolonged spectacle is a clear sign the crowd had lost all human instinct.
And this whole segment concludes with the ultimate failure of crowd reasoning, the illogical extension of their acts.
Right. After dealing with the obvious political enemies, someone suggested that the other prisoners, the aged beggars, the vagabonds, even children ranging from 12 to 17, were useless mouths.
What was the rationale for that?
The rationale was they might become enemies of the nation in the future, and therefore it was, and I quote, clearly well to be rid of them.
So they generalized a specific case. Chilbles are enemies to completely dissimilar people, children and beggars,
resulting in massacre without exception. This is a textbook example of the immediate generalization of a particular idea, which is a hallmark of the crowd's rudimentary reasoning capacity.
And they thought they deserved praise for this.
They genuinely believed they deserved state recompense, decorations, and pensions for their work. It just shows the depth of their self-rationalization. They were not criminals in their own eyes. They were highly valued state functionaries.
Okay, so moving from the anonymous, chaotic street mob to the heterogeneous crowd that is not anonymous, we analyze the criminal jury. The This is a sanctioned, legally binding collective whose decisions shape individual lives, yet psychologically, it functions exactly like any other crowd.
The criminal jury is the perfect laboratory for testing crowd psychology in a structured setting. It shows all the classic traits: suggestibility, low reasoning capacity, domination by unconscious sentiments, even though its members are identifiable.
And the great paradox of intelligence emerges here, something that magistrates like Mitsubirat de Glojob noted in the past.
Yes, there were these deliberate, well-intentioned efforts to select jurors from the most enlightened classes: professors, high-ranking functionaries, men of letters.
And what was the result of this experiment?
The exact same verdicts were reached by those supposedly enlightened juries as by those composed of small tradesmen and petty capitalists.
Which confirms the rule.
It confirms the rule. When assembled, the collective mind takes over. Individual intelligence, legal knowledge, high education levels, they become negligible factors. The collective is swayed solely by unconscious, shared sentiments.
So the mental level of the jury, even an elite one, just defaults to the lowest common denominator of feeling. They aren't swayed by logical, complex legal arguments.
Not at all. They are guided overwhelmingly by emotion and sentimental considerations. They cannot resist the sight of a mother with a child, or simply the pleasant appearance or engaging manner of a woman. A dry legal argument rarely stands a chance against a powerful sentimental image.
This also explains the pattern in their sentencing. They're selectively harsh and selectively lenient.
Exactly. They are severe only on crimes that they instinctively feel could threaten them personally.
Burglary, murder, crimes against property.
Yeah, right. But they display this surprising leniency on crimes of passion, like infanticide or vitriol throwing.
And that leniency stems from their recognition that the law is, in principle, blind and sometimes unjust. It fails to protect the desperate girl, for instance.
Precisely. They subconsciously apply a necessary human temperance to the law's severity. They function as a check against judicial rigidity. It's also noted that despite their democratic composition, juries are very aristocratic in their likes and dislikes.
I know.
Meaning name, birth, wealth, celebrity. All of these things tend to benefit the accused because these factors confer a necessary prestige upon the individual in the eyes of the crowd.
So since logic and intelligence are secondary, the job of the barrister becomes a masterclass in psychological manipulation.
It is entirely about psychological tactics. The barrister's goal is not to convince all 12 individuals rationally.
No.
The strategy is to convince only the leading spirits, one or two energetic, dominant men, who will then carry the rest of the jury through powerful suggestion and contagion, often without uttering another word.
And the celebrated barrister Le Bon provides the perfect anecdote for how a personal favor can outweigh hours of failed argumentation.
It's a fantastic story. Le Bon was struggling desperately with a very difficult case. He had been arguing his most cunning, logically sound points for 3/4 of an hour to no effect.
The jury wasn't buying it.
Not at all. He was losing. Then he realized that the 7th juror, who was a pivotal figure, was squinting uncomfortably. He was being blinded by a ray of sun coming through a partially drawn curtain.
So he stops the legal argument entirely.
He stops, turns to the judge, and addresses him not on the law, but requesting permission to have the curtain moved to shield the juror's eyes.
A small gesture.
The juror reddened slightly, smiled in acknowledgement of the personal attention, and was instantly won over. He was placated by this unexpected, thoughtful favor.
He was secured not by legal argument, but by the fact that the barrister pleased him as an individual. That personal connection preceded the collective conviction.
It highlights the central idea. The crowd is led by sentiment, not analysis. The barrister understood that making the individual feel important or comfortable was a more potent tool than any legal precedent.
Now, despite all these flaws, the emotional bias, the suggestibility, the lack of real justice, the author argues paradoxically that the jury system is indispensable.
He does. He defends the system because, as we mentioned, it tempers the severity of the law. A rigid, professional judge, acting purely on statutes, would be forced to punish the desperate, starving, infanticidal girl and the violent burglar equally.
Because the law doesn't differentiate between motives and social pressure.
Exactly. The jury provides that human element of assessment.
But the author goes even further, offering a powerful indictment of the legal cast that precedes the jury.
He does. He argues that the source of most judicial errors is not the jury, but the magistrates, the examining magistrates and prosecutors, who, through professional bias and adherence to rigid rules, have already subjected the accused to overwhelming prejudice before they even set foot in the jury box.
And this leads to his powerful conclusion regarding tyranny.
Yes. The author concludes that the power of certain castes is to be dreaded yet more than the power of crowds.
Why? What's the reasoning there?
Because crowds, despite their violence and lack of reason, are still open to conviction. They can be swayed or tempered by new suggestions and emotions. Castes, however, due to their ingrained prejudices, professional conservatism, and adherence to inflexible procedure.
Never are.
They never are. They represent an enduring, oppressive despotism.
All right, let's shift now to the sphere of political sovereignty, the electoral crowd. This is a specific type of heterogeneous crowd focused on one predetermined matter.
Choosing a representative. And yet its psychological characteristics display all the classic low-level traits.
That's right. Minimal reasoning, absence of the critical spirit, high irritability, credulity, and profound simplicity. This setting is where the failure of intelligence is most apparent, as talent and genius are, surprisingly, considered negligible elements for electoral success. So, if talent doesn't win elections, what are the true requirements for a successful candidate?
Number one is prestige. The candidate must possess personal prestige, or prestige that comes from significant wealth. This enables him to force himself upon the electorate without needing extensive discussion.
And this explains why the author notes that working men rarely elect one of their own to represent them.
Precisely. They may be surrounded by their peers, but they lack the necessary imposing prestige among the masses they aim to represent. The crowd instinctually follows the figure who stands slightly above them, whether by birth, wealth, or reputation.
Okay, so once prestige is established, the successful candidate must become an expert flatterer and a master of fantastic promises.
Oh, absolutely. They must overwhelm electors with extravagant blandishments and promises that appeal directly to their greed and their vanity.
And the key is exaggeration.
Exaggeration in the verbal program, because the voter rarely checks afterward whether the promises were ever fulfilled. If the candidate is addressing the laboring class, for instance, it is impossible to go too far in insulting and stigmatizing the employers of labor. Exaggeration and affirmation are the required currency.
And the order's primary tool, therefore, is not logic or policy,
No.
but the magical power of words and vague formulas.
Yes. Words whose meanings are ambiguous and abstract hold the most sway. The crowd accepts them with this magical reverence because they synthesize unconscious aspirations without requiring any logical definition.
You're talking about phrases like infamous capital, vile exploiters, or the socialization of wealth.
Exactly. They bypass the rational mind entirely.
The history of the Federal Republic in Spain provides the perfect and honestly absurd illustration of this. The power of a magical phrase devoid of substance.
It's incredible. This was the Spanish Revolution of 1873. The entire populace was galvanized by this magical phrase, Federal Republic.
And everyone loved it.
It delighted everyone, but the author observes that nobody, not the educated and certainly not the voters, could define it precisely. It meant everything to everyone. Emancipation of the provinces, abolition of all authority, social liquidation.
And the result was complete chaos, or cantonalism.
It led to a total localized breakdown. Because the phrase was so vague and so universally accepted, every tiny hamlet and village assumed it meant absolute autonomy. They declared sovereignty, they tried to cut off all communication with their neighbors.
Which just resulted in massacres and chaos.
Massacres and immediate chaos, all based on an undefined magical formula that satisfied the crowd's momentary need for an absolute political god.
This chaos also speaks to the futility of reasoning in the electoral meetings themselves. They aren't debates, they are psychological skirmishes.
Argumentation is utterly useless. Electoral meetings are characterized solely by affirmation, invectives, and frequently physical violence. The historical newspaper reports bear this out universally. You have speakers trading insults, idiot, scoundrel, blackguard, and often chairs and tables are converted into weapons before any policy point can be rationally considered.
And what's crucial here is the authors note that this behavior isn't restricted to uneducated masses.
No, not at all. The source specifically points out that even assemblies composed exclusively of highly educated persons, like students, revert to this exact same low mental level when they're collected in a crowd.
It confirms that leveling effect of the crowd state.
It does. The critical spirit just disappears, regardless of individual intellect.
So if the elections aren't won by talent or decided by reasoning, and the candidate is merely a vessel for vague formulas, who truly holds the votes?
The true rulers are the hidden actors. The election committees, also known as syndicates or clubs, these are often controlled by figures who exert decisive economic influence.
Like publicans who control working men through credit and debt.
Exactly. It's an indirect but far more dangerous form of tyranny.
More dangerous.
Yes, because the tyranny exercised by these committees constitutes the most oppressive form. The leaders, acting in the name of an impersonal collectivity, are freed from all personal responsibility.
I see.
They can ordain prescriptions and political terror that the most savage individual tyrant would never dream of attempting because the blame is just diffused across the committee.
Now, despite admitting all these profound dangers, that civilization is built by an elite minority and that mass votes frequently lead to disaster, the author actually defends universal suffrage in practice. Why does he accept this flawed mechanism?
There are two main reasons. First, there's the political reality of it. The sovereignty of crowds is now an absolute, unattackable dogma. It's as deeply ingrained and politically invincible as the religious beliefs of the Middle Ages.
You can't fight it with discussion.
You can't. Only time and societal evolution can act upon it.
But the more cutting, pragmatic argument relates to the alternative. He suggests restricting the suffrage to an educated elite wouldn't actually improve things.
That's the key insight. He argues that all collectivities, even those of the highly specialized and intelligent, are mentally inferior when gathered. He posits that a vote by 40 academics on complex general social questions, like protectionism or military service, would be no better than a vote by 40 water carriers.
That seems like an extreme claim. Why would academic intelligence not translate into better collective policy decisions?
Because social problems involve so many unknown interacting quantities. The academics, when gathered, would still be guided by sentiment, by prejudice, and by party spirit, just like the common crowd.
So they become substantially equally ignorant.
Equally ignorant of how to solve the unsolvable issues. By restricting the vote, all you would achieve is replacing one form of collective ignorance with the oppressive tyranny of an educated caste, which, as we established, is ultimately more dangerous than the crowd.
Which brings us to the apex of political organization. The legislative crowd or parliamentary assembly. Whether in France, Italy, or America, these bodies, despite their presumed intellectual sophistication, still display all the core crowd traits.
Absolutely. Intellectual simplicity, irritability, suggestibility, and exaggerated sentiments. They are the ultimate example of the heterogeneous, non-anonymous crowd, where the influence of race defines the limits of their volatility.
And their intellectual simplicity. How does that manifest?
It manifests in their approach to complex governance. There's an invariable tendency to solve the most complicated social problems using the simplest abstract principles, and then pushing those principles to an extreme.
Like the members of the French Convention, who, armed with these abstract philosophical principles of rights and liberty, felt they could just fundamentally recast society overnight.
Yes, regardless of historical context or reality, they believe in the magical power of decrees. However, the suggestibility of these assemblies is constrained in a very specific way, and it relates directly back to the electoral crowd we just discussed.
That's the local versus general interest limitation.
Precisely. On local or regional issues, be it protectionist tariffs on a local industry or privileges related to the alcohol trade, a deputy's opinion is rigid. It's unalterable by any amount of eloquence or logical argument.
Because he's already been influenced.
The suggestion from his immediate, powerful local electors, which he received before he ever arrived at the assembly, outweighs all other intellectual stimuli. He is pre-suggested.
But when dealing with general questions, like foreign policy or overthrowing a cabinet, indecision reigns.
That's when it happens. In those moments, the deputy is caught between two counterbalancing suggestions: the abstract fear of the elector back home and the immediate, powerful influence of the party leaders within the assembly.
And it is here that the leaders, the ones with prestige, truly become the masters.
They do. And the leader's influence, once again, is almost entirely due to that prestige, not to argument. If that prestige is lost, their power just vanishes instantly.
The author notes that these leaders, who are required to be apostles rather than analysts, are often of lamentably narrow intellect.
Combined with a fierce, unshakable conviction. Intelligence, by showing the complexity and nuance of an issue, makes a person tolerant, skeptical, and indulgent.
Which blunts the conviction you need to be an apostle for a crowd.
It blunts it completely. Robespierre exemplifies this narrow, powerful conviction perfectly.
Right, his speeches.
His political speeches, when you analyze them historically, were often incoherent. They were filled with platitudes and vague threats, yet his immense, terrifying prestige allowed him to wield dictatorial power. The crowd demands simplicity, affirmation, and fear, all of which he delivered.
And when these legislative assemblies become truly excited, say during a constitutional crisis or a revolution, they revert completely to the state of ordinary, heterogeneous crowds.
Capable of either immense heroism or the worst excesses. Look at the extreme actions of the French Convention. We saw nobility willingly renouncing all their ancestral privileges. We saw members voting to decimate their own ranks, renouncing their own inviolability.
Literally voting themselves onto the scaffold.
They were acting against their personal self-interest, driven by suggestion and a collective sense of hysteria.
They were operating in a completely automatic state.
Yes, essentially hypnotized by the collective spirit of the moment. One member, Belleau-Varenne, even confessed the irrationality of it later. He said, "The decisions were not desired by us 2 days, a single day before they were taken. It was the crisis and nothing else that gave rise to them."
Which just confirms that even the highest legislative body is ultimately a crowd.
A crowd.
So if they are so chaotic, so volatile, and prone to these irrational extremes, why does the author defend parliamentary assemblies as the best form of government found yet?
Because they provide the best means found to escape the yoke of personal tyrannies, especially for the educated and intellectual classes. While chaotic, they are preferable to the rigid, oppressive rule of a single person or a powerful caste.
And they can be effective at some things.
Crucially, they are effective at passing excellent technical laws, but only when those laws are drafted quietly by specialists or individuals. The moment the assembly starts collectively debating and amending them, the laws become disastrous.
But they still face two fundamental systemic dangers. The first is inevitable financial waste.
This is a direct, unavoidable consequence of the democratic mechanism and the politicians' lack of foresight. Deputies must vote for measures that seem to satisfy the immediate demands of the electoral crowds.
Increasing pensions, local grants, unnecessary public works.
Even if those measures strain the national budget, they are prioritizing the immediate electoral consequence over the remote financial reality.
Because the penalty for saying no is losing the next election.
And that's immediate and severe. The consequences of national insolvency are distant and diffused. This leads to staggering examples of wasteful expenditure. The author cites a period where 90 million francs were voted solely for railways of only local utility.
Like the one connecting a small town to a mountain.
A 15 million franc line to connect a town of 3,000 people to a mountain? Yes. The necessity of acceding to similar demands from colleagues' log-rolling forces this cycle of spending to continue unchecked.
And the second, perhaps more insidious danger, is the progressive restriction of individual liberty.
Parliaments are ceaseless lawmaking machines. They multiply innumerable restrictive laws, and they're blind to the fact that this constant intervention leads to a profound loss of spontaneity and energy in the citizenry.
As Herbert Spencer noted.
Yes, the increase of apparent liberty must be followed by the decrease of real liberty as more money is taken for public purposes and more regulations are imposed.
And this endless proliferation of rules creates a single, highly dangerous beneficiary, the administrative caste.
This is the author's final damning indictment. The constant creation of laws necessarily augments the number, power, and influence of functionaries, the bureaucracy charged with their application. This caste is alone in being untouched by these changes.
They possess irresponsibility, impersonality, and perpetuity.
Exactly, and that makes them more dangerous than the crowd or even the legislature itself.
Why more dangerous?
Because it is a permanent, fixed engine of oppression that thrives on legislative chaos. Crowds come and go, governments change hands, parties rise and fall, but the bureaucracy remains, applying, modifying, and enforcing the laws that restrict the freedom of the populace.
Creating an oppressive despotism.
A form of oppressive despotism more tyrannical and enduring than any monarch because it is impersonal and therefore psychologically unassailable.
So we arrive at the author's final, chilling synthesis. The cycle of civilization. When the collective energy declines, what happens?
As a civilization declines, the inherited unifying ideal weakens. The collective egoism that held the state together is replaced by an excessive individual egoism. The unified people breaks down into an agglomeration of individualities lacking cohesion.
It reverts essentially to its original state, that of the pure, unstable crowd.
Yes, the populace becomes sovereign, but without the collective spirit to guide it, the civilization loses its stability entirely. The society becomes an edifice crumbling to ruin, destined to fall at the first storm.
The tide of barbarism returns, and history resets.
Mm.
That journey through the classified crowds, from the savage immediacy of the criminal mob through the sentimental judgments of the jury, the vanity of the electoral booth, and the financial chaos of the legislative assembly, it really demonstrates how fundamentally unstable collective political life is when you analyze it psychologically.
It forces you to rethink every major political decision as a collective emotional response, rather than a considered logical conclusion.
Before we wrap up, let's address a few specific questions from our listeners based directly on this material. First one. Does the book provide any information on what number of people would be considered a crowd? Is it defined by a physical gathering?
That's a crucial clarification. The book specifies that a crowd, in the psychological sense, is not determined by sheer numbers or physical proximity. The mental unity, the vanishing of the conscious personality, that can form without a visible agglomeration.
Can we establish a threshold, though?
Yes. The text explicitly states that at certain moments, half a dozen men might constitute a psychological crowd.
Just 6 people.
Just half a dozen. And this is contrasted with hundreds of men gathered together by accident who do not form a crowd. Conversely, you could have thousands of isolated individuals all across a country under the influence of a great national event or unified religious dogma, and they can acquire the characteristics of a psychological crowd without ever standing next to one another.
So it relies on the shared direction of feelings and thoughts, not the number.
Exactly.
Okay, our second question. How would the author view our contemporary society with modern institutions like schools, churches, movie theaters, and massive media spectacles?
Well, the author's primary psychological law is that crowds operate on images and suggestion, not reason, and their resulting convictions, he argues, inevitably assume a religious shape.
Demanding blind submission and intolerance.
Right. Therefore, any institution or mechanism that relies on popular imagination would be viewed as an incredibly potent shaper of collective sentiment.
So the spectacle of a movie theater or a mass media event.
Spectacles and theatrical representations influence the crowd immensely because, to the collective mind, the unreal has almost as much influence as the real.
Right.
The crowd is delighted or terrified by images, and there's that historical anecdote of theatrical managers needing to protect actors who played villains from the audience's fury. It highlights this lack of distinction between image and reality. These institutions bypass reason entirely to implant images and suggestions.
And what about traditional religious institutions, like churches?
The author contends that the crowd has a fundamental, incurable need for a god before everything else. So while they might reject the traditional words divinity and religion, they simply replace them with new political or social dogmas.
Like socialism or atheism?
Yes, and those new beliefs will assume the exact same fanatical religious form. They'll demand submission, require propaganda, and exhibit complete intolerance. The function of the church in satisfying the need for submission and collective passion is simply transferred to the political sphere.
Finally, what is the genius of the racing crowds, and what is its influence in simple terms?
In simple terms, the genius of the race is the most powerful and foundational factor. It is the inherited groundwork of a people's thought process, and it acts as a solid substratum for all crowd behavior.
And its influence is crucial.
Crucial because it limits the crowd's changes of humor and volatility. It ensures that a French crowd, despite its psychological collapse, will still behave fundamentally differently than an English crowd. Most importantly, the acquisition of this solidly constituted collective spirit is what allows a people to escape the pure, destructive, barbarian state and establish a cohesive, enduring civilization.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for the day, drawn directly from the ultimate fate described in the source material. Given that institutions and governments are merely transitory expressions of a race's fundamental character, and that organized crowds inevitably lead to financial waste and the rise of an oppressive, impersonal bureaucratic caste, perhaps the only thing currently postponing the final, inevitable barbarian phase of our civilization is the extreme instability and growing indifference of modern crowds to general beliefs.
A fascinating paradox, That the modern crowd's lack of strong absolute conviction might just be the one thing saving us from the immediate establishment of a single, absolute, tyrannical dogma.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the applied psychology of the crowd.
Always a pleasure.
If you enjoyed synthesizing complex ideas and want a shortcut to being well-informed, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more explorations into complex ideas.